All right, well, thank you very much. I have to say, one of my good friends, Matt Shearer, is also presenting here, and I was really hoping to be able to come and join you. Unfortunately, I caught a case of the con crud last weekend and felt that this was the best, worst alternative. So this slide deck was put together based on my experience that I had as an independent IT security practitioner when management came to me and said, we have an existing WAF project that's been failing for about 3 months. We had 35 different web applications that we had to protect with the web application firewall, and we simply were not making any traction. I was brought in to this project to try to turn it around and to try to deploy 35 WAFs in under 3 months. And this is the story about how ultimately I was successful. We were successful as a team. So that being said, I'm at Micah K. Brown on Twitter. On my GitHub, github.com/Micah K. Brown, I've published this talk and many other of my talks. I'm a fine smoker of fine meats and even finer cocktails in my spare time. So let's get through and start to examine what is a WAF, or a web application firewall. Now, I'm not going to read to you this very technical definition. To me, a web application firewall, or WAF, is a compute device that sits in between your web servers and your web users. The web users will first make an encrypted connection between themselves and the web application firewall. The web application firewall will go through and intercept, decrypt, inspect, and then if it's chosen to move forward, or if the policy allows that traffic to move forward, the WAF will generally re-encrypt that traffic, generally TLS, from the WAF to the front-end web server. So to me, that is what a web application firewall looks like. And this is one visualized. You can see over here on our left side, we have our user who happens to be in Ireland, and they're wanting to go to my fictitious website. And so when they do a DNS lookup, they're given the IP address a.a.a.a. Now, in this visualization, I'm going through and I have a website that has a load balancer in front of the WAFs. That's because I want to be able to go through and do things like high availability. So I terminate the public DNS record on the load balancer. The load balancer will pick which, and it could be one to many different WAFs to send that traffic. And usually, at least the web balancers that I've used, I've always used the sticky configuration. That way, if a specific user starts using WAF 3, it's always going to use WAF 3 as long as WAF 3 is available. Now, from that end, in this case, this is an architectural decision. In general, you can have most web application firewalls that I've played with have the capability to function as a load balancer themselves. However, in this example, I've gone through and put a load balancer in front of the applications or the web application servers. And the reason why I did that is sometimes I want to be able to put different policies, different access based on whether it's coming from, say, external users or maybe internal users. So that might be one reason why you go through and you have a load balancer in front of your front-end web devs. So, as I said, I came onto this project, and day one, I sat down with the various people. I started off with the project owner, the project manager. I understood what were the challenges there. I went through and I talked to the people actually working on it, figured out what was going on there, and then I grabbed a big old bottle of bourbon, sat underneath a tree with my board of drawing, and I started to identify all the different steps that I would have to do in order to be successful. And I want to acknowledge, many of my slides are very dense, and that's on purpose because I want you, if you find this talk interesting, I want you to be able to download the slide deck, to take it offline, and to have it be something that is useful for you. And what I learned from that day, from my meditation, was I had identified what parts of building a web application firewall were going to come easy to me. I realized what parts were going to come a little bit harder. You see, a good IT security program should touch all aspects of IT and IT security. And there's, based on how I came into IT, it was help desk to server admin to network admin to full-time IT security person. So I'm really good at like the enterprise architecture. I'm really good at standing up new servers. I'm really good at the networking components. Where I'm my weakest is my application security. Now that doesn't mean I can't do application security things, but what it means is I have to spend more effort to go through and to do application security than something that's more naturally in my wheelhouse. And so I thought about Russ, the person that was leading this project. And it was, something became very clear to me. Where I was my strongest, he was his weakest. And where I am my weakest, that's how he got into IT, was through application development. So app dev, DevSecOps, that comes natural to Russ. And so that got me thinking, you know, we have been trying to push one person to do all of the tasks. And I thought that just doesn't make sense. We're not setting each other up for success. And so what I did was I pivoted. I drew a very crude example of what became known as the build, tune, support model. And I thought I'd hit on something, dividing the WAF deployment into 3 stages: the build, the tune, and the support. And the way you use this methodology is you have ideally a resource or more in each of these 3 teams from your deployment side. And you start from the bottom and moving up. And once you pass the top of one phase, then it gets kicked over, that WAF gets kicked over to the next vertical. So really is going to be going through steps, outlining the clear roles and responsibilities. As you can see, I've had them listed here in or to the right of each step, and we're going to finish out with some architectural considerations. So I jokingly, well, somewhat jokingly say that building a web application firewall is one of the worst projects that I've actually ever done. In fact, you'll notice a running joke in the transition slides. Now, why is that? To me, it's because you have so many disciplines that have to converge in one place. In my view, a WAF has a very high total cost of ownership, and we need to be open and honest when we talk to management about that. We're telling our application developers, many of them which are incentivized by thought, by deed, by action, by the amount of their bonus, by what? By system uptime. Now, IT security is coming to them and saying, we're going to put a device that the only reason that it exists is that it goes through, it intercepts your traffic, and it makes permit, deny decisions on your traffic. Where is their head immediately going to go? What if it makes the wrong call? What if it takes down production? What if it gets in the way and becomes a blocker? So we need to go through and we need to show maturity. We need to earn their trust. We need to be able to clearly define what a post-SDLC lifecycle under a WAF looks like. We had conflicts with work that was already in the app dev pipeline, stuff that we were not aware of, and now we're asking them to go through and to give more hours to IT security that isn't meeting their goals that they've already committed to. Of course, a lot of this was about winning the trust from the app dev team. And this one caught me by surprise because I don't run in the DevSecOps world a lot. I found out that not all of our environments were equal when I'm talking about feature by feature. There was one environment, or there's one company that we were putting WAFs in where their lowest level environment, they had 5 different versions of it, and certain functionality was only present in 1 or 2 of those. So That made it really challenging, and we ended up not deploying to that lowest level environment because it wasn't uniform. It wasn't representative of the higher level environments. And finally, how do we put the WAF in line? Typically, you can do this one of two ways: either leverage DNS, or you can go through and you can physically put the actual WAF in line of live network traffic. Personally, I prefer DNS. It makes it much more easier, much more graceful to put the WAF in line and take it out of line if needed. So let's talk about the teams that you're going to need. Well, first, you're going to need someone on the build team. That's someone like myself, somebody that understands networking, IT architecture, cloud architecture, and understands how do we bring new technologies into our environment? How do we get a server turned up? How do we go through and navigate all of the change control, all of that bureaucracy? Next, you're going to need a tuning resource. And this is somebody that's going to need to understand application development, DevSecOps, app dev, knows how to respond and remediate vulnerabilities. And finally, we're going to need someone at the end of the day, because the build and the tune resources, at some point in time, they're going to leave. So we need to build, as we're building and as we're tuning, the actual support team skills so that they can build, care, maintain these web application firewalls, because these are critical devices. Now, on team application, we're going to need the application owner. Generally, this will be a manager or an architect of an application. They don't need to be technical, but they're going to be the ones that are usually held accountable for system uptime or other key performance indicators. They need to be able to pull in the correct technical people if there is an issue or if we need assistance. We're going to need dedicated application developers, people that really understand how their environment works, so that when we get an alert, we can partner with them and say, hey, is this the application running normally? Or is this something that really does look kind of malicious to us? So one of the things that we really learned early on is the importance of both the application developers as well as the testers, getting them in terms of being in the meetings, being part of the process, getting them excited about this stuff. And finally, the testers. We need to go through and we need to have both a volumetric appropriate amount of testing as well as diversity of functionality testing. One of the main mistakes that we made in one of our early WAFs is we focused on the actual alerts that happened the most often. And so when we had that alert that only happened, once every month or once every other month, in our case, it was an ACH chargeback. That functionality was seen as a vulnerability. And so when it happened, the WAF blocked it. And if you don't know, you have a very short time frame that if you do have to do an ACH chargeback, legally it has to be done very quickly. So that required us to go through and to have to get with the application developers, the WAF team, and find out, was that block? Was it really us? And if so, why did we go through and why didn't we catch it in a lower environment? In our case, that functionality was never tested in lower environments. There is no way that we could have caught it. And so that taught us the lesson that moving forward, we needed to test both diversity of traffic and volume of traffic. And that's going to be a running phase with this talk. So let's talk about the best phase of the build, tune, support. And of course, that's the build phase. So our first step is setting up our architecture. And this is us defining how our WAFs are going to work, how we're going to deploy them, what are we trying to do with them. And so on top of just building out your overall WAF architecture, you need to think, in our case, we had to have separate supporting WAF systems to go through and to allow centralized management, centralized logging, as well as licensing. And one of the mistakes that was made was not understanding the functionality of, say, the licensing server. Any WAF that we licensed would need to be able to talk to each of these three systems. So does it make sense to put these systems on an internal DM or an internal VLAN? Initially, that's where they were placed, but then we found out that certain, say, cloud native apps that we were trying to put in, they were not able to reach those because there was no network connection. So how do we work around that? So we had to get a little bit creative with reverse proxies, but this is all part of the discovery process, and we want to make sure that within our architecture, we fully flush out all of the use cases that we're going to go through and we're going to need. The next phase really talks about going through and starting to build that partnership with the app owner, the app developers, to really understand how that application works, both today and then communicate a unified vision of how that environment will work in the future. So for us, we created what we called implementation guides. And this was critical for us. This was a key thing that I started because I realized we weren't winning trust. And I wanted to prove by thought, by deed, by action that we are professional, we have a plan, and this is how we're going to implement a WAF for your environment. So these implementation guides, it was a bunch of documentation. It started out with an executive summary. What is a WAF? Then it had a section, how does this environment look today? And we would leverage design documentation from the application owner, application developers. We had described the environment. We get their approval. Yes, that's how it looks in our environment. And then we create a formal overview. This is how we're going to implement a web application. The rest of the document was going through each phase within the build, tune, support document, and it called out each section, what was needed, what tasks were to be done, who had what roles and responsibilities, what the SLAs were, and whenever possible, we added visualizations. A lot of these sections actually would go through and have a table for each of the environments that we were deploying into, usually like a test stage prod. And so we would fill out, and this is before we build a single WAF, we build out the entire configuration in this implementation guide so that we're being open, we're being transparent, we're proving to the application owners and application developers that we have a team. But what are we also doing? We're also going through and making it very simple for me to communicate how this environment was built in a repeatable way to not only the tuning team, but also to the support team. This document could be used used to give to auditors to validate how is this website, this web application being protected by a WAF. It could be used by a support member coming on, figuring out, okay, how do I support this specific web environment? So this one document, I think it was the key enabler to allow us to go through and to roll out quite quickly. And that's one of the interesting things is we had to go slow in building out this implementation guide so that we could go fast later. And truthfully, we rolled out over 35 web application firewalls in 3 months using this methodology. So once we go through and we get this implementation guide, we're eventually going to gain the agreement of the app owner and the app dev that, yeah, we think we have a solid plan, let's move forward. That doesn't mean that the plan doesn't change, because these implementation guides, they are living, breathing documents. They're still in use today. But once we get the formal approval for the design, now comes the fun part, the cold build, where I work with the various people that I need to either build the new web application firewall. Now, in our case, we went through and we built our WAFs 2 ways. One was company provided virtual images that are on-prem. The other one was ARM templates in the cloud. So we would go through, we would roll out an initial web application policy. We would do the configuration of the WAF. In our case, we had all of those parameters already defined and agreed to within the implementation guide. So that was pretty simple. And at some point, we're ready to enable the WAF the app dev team, as well as the testers, to go through and modify their host files so that only their traffic could be routed through the web application firewall so that they could do some testing. Now, it was during this time is when we first started to have the tuning resource start to work with app dev and testers just to validate that things were working. And once again, both volume of traffic and diversity of traffic is critical. While it might make sense to prioritize resolving those alerts that are happening more frequently, also look at the alerts that only happen very rarely, because those could actually be critical functionality that isn't used often in your environment. At some point, the app owners and the testers are going to say, yeah, everything looks to be good. And that's where we get ready to go in line. Once we get the app owner's approval to go in line in a learning or transparent mode, we'll get a date, we'll get the needed resources, and I would do this by an implementation bridge. In fact, at the end of this presentation, I've got all of that laid out for you. And it was a very kind of informal meeting. So I'd open it up about 10 minutes before, 5 minutes before implementation window. I'd hold a go, no go. If we had a go, I would go through at the time that the maintenance window became valid. I'd ask the DNS team to please migrate the IPs on the DNS. That would put the WAF virtually in line, well, it would be in line with that environment's real traffic. Once that happened, I would go through, I'd do a couple different tests, one on network, one off network, just make sure that we were resolving correctly, that it did appear to propagate. And by the way, we lowered our TTLs to like 90 seconds, so it was very quick for us. But once it looks like we had become in line, I'd ask the networking team or whoever had the specific ACLs that needed to be changed to go ahead and make any needed changes. The idea is that once a WAF is in line with that traffic, we don't want somebody to go through and to be able to bypass and access those front-end web servers applications without going through the WAF. And once that happened, I'll be running some more checks. I generally would go through and test the crypto ciphers. I'd make sure that Qualys SSL Labs was giving me the same strength, the same ciphers. In truth, I've never had to pull a WAF out of line of traffic in one of these calls. It was always smooth. It was always successful, but that's because we did a lot of testing ahead of time. Now, at the end of this call, something magical happens. Well, two things happens. First, I transition the WAF over to the tuning phase, and I'm out of this WAF. I'm on to the next one. The second is we now start 24/7 support. So during the business day, the tune resources have it, but if something happens after hours, our support team was starting to get hand-on experience in actually supporting WAFs. So now let's talk about the tune phase. So when we first go in line with the WAF, we'll be in a learning transparent mode. That means that WAF will alert if it sees something odd that it would block if we were in blocking, but instead it just gives us an alert and we go through and we investigate it. So at the start of the tuning phase, our tuning resource would meet with the app dev to review every learning suggestion, and they do 1 or 2 hours a day. Once again, both volume and diversity of traffic is critical. You want to make sure that if you're doing additional testing, you're not only testing the common things, but also the niche functionality that happens once or twice. And it's critical at this point that you do have your testers constantly going in there and doing both what I call hands-on keyboard functionality testing as well as automated testing. Now, generally, we found that after the first 4 or 5 days of being in transparent mode, the volume of alerts as we do our tuning drops dramatically. And at some point, it might be 1 week, it might be 2 weeks, it might be 3 weeks, but at some point, your application developers, your application owners, and your tuning resource are going to feel comfortable that we've got this specific WAF tuned for that specific environment. Once you get the app owner's approval and you get a maintenance window, we're going to start making plans to put the WAF into blocking mode. So for the initial tuning, once we get the maintenance window and the approval, once again, we did this by a bridge call. Once again, we made sure we had all needed parties. So the tuning resource, we'd want application developers, we'd want testers at a bare minimum as a part of this call. And truthfully, with our web application firewalls, it took longer for our resources to log in and navigate to the configuration page than it did for them to go through and switch the actual WAF from binding to transparent, or from transparent to blocking mode. It was really pretty simple. They'd click apply. We'd allow the testers as well as the application developers to go through and to test. And once again, when we went into blocking, we did not have to revert back into tuning during that maintenance window, which was a really good feeling. And finally, the support phase. So I'm a big believer in like checklists, like start of day, start of week, start of month procedures, day in, day out support, regular review of learning suggestions for new alerts, tracking any move, add, change tickets, troubleshooting performance issues, doing the basics like patching, making sure documentation is updated, and for the sake of Pete Rose, making sure that the support team has the necessary training so that they can be successful. So now, that's the basic of the build, tune, support phase. Let's talk a little bit about the actual architecture. So, we had the choice of using physical or virtual machines as well as cloud. We leveraged virtual machines on premises. And that was a big win for us in my personal view. I love the ideas that before doing a change, take a snapshot, implement the change, and if you have to roll back, you got a snapshot for that. It's not perfect, but it is a great way to go through and have a plan B. How do you want to intercept? Well, for me, it's a lot easier, a lot faster, a lot safer to change a DNS record to pull a WAF in and out of line of traffic than having to have someone go into the data center and physically move Ethernet cables. We always made sure that the management port was on an internal protected management VLAN, and we wanted to make sure that the front-end web application servers should not be internet accessible once under the protection of a WAF. So we usually had to make some ACL changes. This is a view of our on-prem architecture. So you'll notice that in general, we went through, let me get my mouse over here. We've got our production up here at the top, lower level environment. We terminated the IP directly on the actual WAF itself, whereas in our production, we used a load balancer to go through and give us high availability. Within our on-premise WAFs, we deployed them into the same VLAN as the same DMZ where that traffic was going through originally. Our front-end web servers were one VLAN behind there, so we were deploying into the native existing locations where the original load balancers that held the IPs went through and held originally. That being said, that worked very well for us. So what about some cloud considerations? So one of the things that we initially thought of was we'll just clone what we're doing on-prem in the cloud. However, the way that my organization, which is a very large organization, does go through and manage cloud is we give our DevSecOps folks a whole lot of power in the cloud. We want them to be able to innovate. We want them to truly live that DevSecOps lifestyle. And so while we do want to enable them, the way that we would go through and that if we put it all in the same virtual compartment just like we did on-prem, then the DevSecOps folks would be able to go through and to take our WAFs in and out of line of traffic for that environment without having to go through and to follow the approved change control process. And that's something that just didn't sit well for us. So instead, we created a second, in our case, VNet for IT security. We go through and we use the exact same VNet that just my group owned. And then we would pass from our VNet onto our customers' or our applications, DevSecOps team's VNet cluster once the traffic was approved. So let's talk a little bit about policy. Initially, I was very naive about application and application security. I thought that we would have a single policy across the entire application. And so one of the applications we were protecting had to do with policy. How can people go through and make claims against their policy? How can they pay on their policy? How can they see what their policy covers, what it doesn't? And part of the website actually allowed users to upload data directly to us. Now, generally this was going through and proving that if they did suffer a loss, they could upload a video or a picture or scan a document and send it to us. And so the way that one specific subsection worked, it had what was viewed as that it could go through and that it could be abused. And it came up as an alert and that it would be blocked. Now, obviously, this is functionality that is critical for the operation of the business. So we were initially talking, well, do we just allow this type of activity across all the site? Instead, what we chose to do is our WAFs had what was called a child policy. And so for that particular part of the website, and only that file upload section was the only place where we allowed that type of call to be made. And that way we were able to go through and technically allow that where it was needed, but still deny it across the much larger part of the application. And I think, while it does add a little bit of complexity, I think it was definitely worth it. Also, we found that, as I mentioned before, lower level environments might not be identical. So my view is that you want to deploy a WAF to the lowest point in your environment, A, where it makes sense, and B, that is functionally identical to production. That way, hopefully you find bugs lower in the environment and you can push out a patch, push out an update as your new code is going through the test, dev, production lifecycle. That another interesting lesson we learned is pay attention to cryptography. There were a bunch of production applications that we found that were using vendor supplied / generic wildcards. We also found that some of the cipher strengths were not adequate. And we need to make sure that we're using our trusted and authorized CAs. My apologies there. Now, this was an artifact of my naivete when it came to my understanding of DevSecOps. I was expecting that we would go through and we would find a bug in test, and that once we found that bug in text, we would push that update to stage and to prod, so that as the code migrated throughout the software development lifecycle, we would not be causing issues in higher level environments. In fact, I was viewing production as the now state of production. I was viewing stage as the near future state of production. I was viewing test as the future version of production. And because we didn't have as much testing in test originally, what became a very common theme was we are finding bugs, alerts, whatever you want to call them, in higher level environments like stage and prod. And so we had to come out with a way in how, if we found something in a higher level in prod, how do we push it down to all of the lower level environments, as well as if it's in stage, how do we safely push it both to test and to production? So that's just one thing that, testing, especially in lower level environment, but throughout all of your environments, of both diversity and volume of traffic is absolutely critical to a proper web application install. Next, what triggers a policy push? Do you do it regularly? Do you sync it up with your SDLC whenever they move code from lower level environments to higher level environments? And there's no right and wrong answer here. And in fact, you're probably going to have a blended approach, but this is the type of conversations that you should start to have with the application team so that you are seen as all being on one team, trying to make sure that the web application is not only protected from all things external, but also, unfortunately, we can cause issues with the WAF and cause interruptions to service to the applications. And we need to acknowledge that and do whatever is within reason to help lower those environments. Now, some of the WAFs that I've worked with, they have a centralized management center that if you find a block, let's say in the lower level environments, and you want to allow that, you can click allow and it'll ask you, do you want to allow it just in the lower level environment or do you want to push that out? And that's great technology if you have that. If you don't, then you probably need to go through and keep very detailed records of what environments or what environmental names each component of the web application firewall, so that you can do that manual transfer, so that you know how you can transfer a test rule to a dev rule to a prod rule. For example, one of the things that we did is we kept our naming of environmental variables the same, except for test would start with a TST dash, prod would have a PRD, and depending on what other environments, we'd use a different flag. But that way we had consistency. So we knew that if we had a test rule, we could just replace the first three letters of those environments all throughout the web application firewall rule, and we would be good. Hopefully you've got a centralized management tool, but if not, you need to be able to do that manual tweaking of rules so you can move them in the environment. Next is when you're going through and you're propagating a new learning suggestion, a new alert, a new configuration item, whatever you want to call it. When do you migrate just that one rule versus the entire policy? One thing that I've seen happen with many, with web application firewalls, is that if you aren't on top of it, if you are not very meticulous, that you can have a drift between the actual configuration from lower level environments to higher level environments. And that's not entirely a good thing. So while I do appreciate doing the vast majority of pushes being individual learning suggestions, alert configurations, I also believe that at some point, and this could be quarterly, this could be biannually, this could be yearly, you ought to go through and to select one policy. Usually I choose production, modify that, and push the entire policy down to the lower level environments once it has been suitably altered. So we've already talked a little bit about the child policies. Initially, I was kind of questioning it, but that really became a huge win for us. And so I really did appreciate that the more that we went on with that. And finally, we're making a lot of decisions, a lot of move, add changes. So how do we track this not only for our sake, but audit? Every time that we go through and we say, allow this type of traffic, that's the equivalent of adding a firewall rule, which had to go through change control. So this was something that was we had to set a culture of discipline, as well as we had to go through and maintain a list of what policy modifications we are going through and making.
This talk was a part of our 2022 Secure West Virginia Lucky 13 conference. If you would like more information about this talk or our speaker, check the description below. And if you enjoyed the content, consider liking and sharing this video. For more information on Secure West Virginia, or you want to stay updated with the latest upcoming events, follow us on Twitter at SecureWVCon or visit our website securewv.org. We would also like to thank our 2022 sponsors for being a huge part of Lucky 13's success.